React class components. React provides the parent class component. This can be extended to create a class component. As covered in a previous video, there are two types of components: functional components, which use functions, and class components, which of course use classes. And I have an example of a class component right here. Notice the class keyword, the name of the class, in this case example, the extends keyword for showing inheritance, that is extending an existing class, and component as the parent class, the child class example is extending. Notice at the bottom there's also export default example. Again, as covered in the previous video talking about functional components, React, when it converts JSX into JavaScript, is looking at whatever is exported. And in this case, what is exported is an object, because objects are, or classes are, future objects. So in this case, we have an example, which is also an object, and so everything's totally fine. But this is a class component instead of being a function, in which case it would have been a functional component. Now, there's some interesting new rules that we have to keep in mind when we use class components. The first of which is this: all class components must include a render method. Now, the reason why this is because if we were using functional components, whatever we returned would be the JSX or the HTML that would show on the page corresponding to that component. In the case of class components, it can't return anything because classes don't return. Instead, it must include a method called render that returns that JSX, that HTML. This allows us then, again, thinking about components as section of a web page, to either write a functional component which returns JSX, or a class component which contains a method called render which returns JSX. So there's an extra step there. Now, the extra requirements for a class component we'll talk about in future videos, but the one that's most important right now is this render method. So if we use class components, that is, if we extend React's component class, we must include a method called render, and render should return some JSX. Now, it doesn't have to, it can technically return nothing, but again, thinking of sections of a web page in a more visual design, it should probably return something. So I'm going to move over to Visual Studio Code, and let's look at an example of this, building on the example that showed up in the functional components video. So in functional components, we had this function called app. In this case, I've now translated it into a class component. Now notice the class keyword, and that'll help us connect those two ideas. Class app extends. What does it extend? It extends component. Now notice component right here is not React.component. I've done something interesting up here on line 1. If you've seen React before, you might have seen React.component. Well, in this case, I'm just using component. So I have import React, comma, and then in curly brackets, component. So in this case, I didn't actually want to write React.component. I just wanted component. So in this case, I'm using what's known as a destructuring assignment, which is something that's part of JavaScript EX6. I can destructure a more complex data structure during assignment. So the import keyword is actually assignment, right? If this was node, we would say, like, variable React would be equal to require something. But because we're using JavaScript EX6, it's using the import keyword, so import from. Think of the from, though, as the equal sign in this case. So it would be React is equal to whatever comes from React. So in this case, we have import React, and that's what the comma is saying, import React and destructure what would have been React and only take out a single property of component. So in other words, if we just want component, we can include it right here, but make sure we put it in curly brackets to show that we're destructuring the React object and just taking out a single property of it, which in this case is the parent class component. That's a whole lot of technical explanation to just say, if we don't want to write React.component right here, we can put a comma and just include component up here. And in fact, most of my examples will show that because it's easier to write. So we have class component, class app, extends, component. And I've defined it like any other class, so notice opening, closing curly brackets. And I followed the rule that I stated during the slides. It has a render method. So again, if we're writing functional components, they should return some JSX. If we're creating class components, it must have a render method which should return JSX. That's sort of extra rule for class components. Now notice here, again, this is the exact same code that showed up in the functional component. I've now converted it and put it as a return inside a render method. In fact, if I move over to Firefox, we can see this in action. We see it looks exactly the same. Because as far as React is concerned, it is. So functional components, class components, React doesn't really care as long as we abide by its rules. That is, and again to repeat myself here, functional components should return JSX. Class components must have a render method which should return JSX. So there's an extra step for class components, that is, classes based on the React parent class component, or functional components, which are just a function, again, could be a function or an arrow function, as talked about in a previous video, that return JSX, or with a class component, have a render method which should return JSX. So again, just that extra step for class components, which are extending the parent class component from React. And we'll glance at the code one more time as I close out this video. So again, if we're creating a class component, it'll look like this, and there are more rules we will talk about in the future. But the most important one is this right here, that we must have a render method as part of that class, and the render method should return JSX, and it is right here. This HTML, or what appears to be HTML, is actually XML. And so that's the two major comparisons and the two types of components we'll see. Functional components, again, or class components, and both of which are objects. So again, when React is converting this from XML into JavaScript, it can use either. It can use functions, which are objects, or classes, which objects can be built from. So both are kinds of objects. So that closes out this video as an introduction to class components. As we build in future videos, there are of course more rules and more things we can talk about in both functional and class components. But the central thing to keep in mind, right? When we're using class components, it must have a render method which should return JSX. And if we're just using functional components, it should return JSX by itself because it is a function.